Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. The time is February 2001. The place is the borough of Queens in New York City in the neighborhood of Astoria. Yours truly, Curmudgeons, were roommates in a very old but nifty 3-bedroom apartment that, to this day, I still get nostalgic about. I was working a menial job as a production assistant at a small publishing company. Chris was working a less menial but no more fulfilling job. We were both 25-year-old outsider geeks still finding ourselves in the world and within ourselves. Sex and the City, this was not. But we did have some good times and we enjoyed ourselves. A big part of that was our mutual music nerdiness that had the most perfect locational outlet imaginable in New York City itself, the musical center of the country. Ah, yes, countless Saturdays spent spending our meager earnings at Other Music, Greenwich Village's definitive hipster record store that specialized in obscurities and rarities for music aficionados like us. Going to shows 3 to 4 times a month at legendary venues such as Irving Plaza, the Bowery Ballroom, the Knitting Factory, and even smaller bars all across the city. We were always pretty eclectic with our musical taste. Chris's freakiness trended toward hardcore hip-hop and underground urban dance music, which eventually rubbed off on me, while my freakiness trended toward exotic sounds from Africa and my burgeoning interest in the Brazilian Tropicalia movement of the 1960s and 70s. At this time, though, we found a rock and roll commonality in our indie rock preferences, namely Built to Spill, Modest Mouse, Sleater-Kinney, and, at least for me, Pavement. This was the musical context we found ourselves in when, one day in February '01, Chris was tipped off by one of his music journalist contacts about this new band from Detroit called the White Stripes. I forget the particulars, but we somehow scored tickets to see this band we had never heard of or heard before. We scored tickets to see them at the Bowery Ballroom on February 28th. Yes, I looked online to find the exact date of the show. We didn't think much of it, much less to listen to this band's music, and chalked it up to being fortunate enough to score affordable tickets to see a random show. Cool beans. What we saw that evening on that stage was, without exaggeration, rock and roll reborn. It was everything we loved about 1960s garage rock, everything we loved about blues-infused classic 1970s heavy rock a la Led Zeppelin, everything we loved about the raw primal fury of 1970s punk, and everything we loved about the postmodern, self-consciously cool attitude of 1990s alternative rock, wrapped up in a fresh, stylish, aesthetically colorful, emotionally charged, minimally conceptual, and artistic package that inverted rock's DNA while providing a 500 megawatt jolt to its nervous system. Seemingly in one fell swoop, mookish rap metal was dead and a thing of the past. Our beloved indie rock faves, while still great, weren't so cutting edge anymore. The White Stripes brand of raw, dirty, gritty, loud, gut bucket, garage blues punk was, at the time, and to us and to a lot of the underground music cognoscenti at the time, the most exciting sound in rock music since a certain trio from Aberdeen, Washington, that shall remain nameless, busted onto the scene exactly 10 years earlier. Between that time and July of that year, which is when they released their third album, White Blood Cells, which would be their breakthrough, I devoured and was obsessed with their first two albums, the self-titled debut and Distill. Little did I or Chris know that the White Stripes would go on to be the defining band of the first decade of the 21st century, the last die-in-the-wool, blood and guts rock and roll band that would be both critically acclaimed and commercially huge. In light of this, yours truly, Curmudgeons, ask the question, were they the last great American rock and roll band? We'll try to answer that in this latest episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report, The White Stripes, A Legacy.
25 years ago, there was a young guy named John Gillis who lived in Detroit, about 21 years old. And, he was a kind of a creative, curious, almost savantic, if that's a word, type. And he had managed to find his way into opening an upholstery store, which means he was probably on his way to a successful life because upholsterers do pretty well for themselves. It's a good thing that he had this other interest on the side known as rock and roll and playing guitar. And he found his way into founding the White Stripes. We're talking about Jack White, of course. This will be a good episode, man. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of John Gillis, who later became Jack White, is exactly our age. He was born in 1975, we were. And the White Stripes, yeah. And in 2001, 2002, 2003, the White Stripes are basically a big part of the soundtrack to our mid-20s.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I love that you brought back up the story of how we literally stumbled into finding out about the White Stripes.
Yeah.
Again, it was just like, we had a buddy coming into town and it's like, well, what are we going to do? And so, I look around and I'd only heard of the band and they were starting to get some buzz. Cause remember that was like ground floor of the whole garage thing where, it's like the soundtrack to our lives. And some of those Swedish bands were starting to get a push first.
The High.
And then, yeah, exactly. And then, so, was able to track down these tickets, having never heard them. Didn't even know what they looked like, just that they were a buzz band. And hey, they were at the Bowery Ballroom, hadn't been there in a little while. And so, you, me, and two of our college buddies, we venture out. We wanted to eat first. So we found this, just sort of randomly. And we used to do this back then. Oh, yeah, this place looks interesting. And so, we wait in line for like 20 minutes. It turns out to be like one of those uppity ass restaurants. And, we take a seat, we order appetizers, and this, the very metrosexual dickhead manager comes in and kicks us out basically for ordering, how dare you? You're at a table and I have all these people that are going to pay real money, and how dare you order appetizers? And yeah, I remember I got pissed. But anyway, we went over to the show and absolutely got blown away.
Yeah.
Because just visually at the time too, they were still doing their red and white thing, but they also, like Jack White, had a setup where he had two mics at an angle and all these foot pedals in front of him. And just, choosing different mics and angles and all this other stuff, and just watching him work. And then you had Meg White, who's this cute girl who was playing her drum set like toys, just boom, 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 boom. And so it's okay. And it just had a very hypnotic effect. It was kind of like what would happen if you had Led Zeppelin and took away everyone except Jimmy Page.
Yeah.
And then just hired some bum off the street to, be the drummer. It was just kind of extraordinary. And so Yeah, we're going to talk about that vibe, and both of us immediately knew that band was special.
Yeah, I'm going to go online, try and find the vintage concert poster for that February 28th show at the Bowery. See if I can find
Yeah.
it.
Hey, trivia. Do you remember who opened?
Oh God, I think I do. Oh, was it that feminist punk band?
Yes, The Gossip.
The Gossip. Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was underwhelmed by them.
Yeah, they were a fun show. I mean, they weren't a great band, but they were a fun show, like Big Girl and a Cat o' Nine Tails,
Yeah.
Hey, more power to her. But yeah, it was a fun night. It was a night of discovery. And yeah, it was definitely indicative of how we was rolling when we was 25 years old, living
Yeah.
in New York City.
Going to restaurants and order only appetizers. That was our style.
Apparently it made us dickheads, which, obviously for us made them dickheads. Why? Because we didn't fit in Manhattan. We were like the worst Manhattanites on the face of the planet.
We fit in Queens, though.
We definitely fit in Queens. We definitely fit in that neighborhood. And that might speak to why I fit in suburban Houston and you fit in a few hours outside of Seoul, South Korea here in 2022.
Yeah.
So on that note, shall we go through the wormhole into the parallel universe?
Let's do that. Let's get out of our comfort zone and into this other weird world where rock music is still a pop cultural thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody over there has weird mustaches and wears like red and white outfits, and everybody's in a costume, and we all love them. Hey, which reminds me, are we not men? No, we are Devo, and we still are in the parallel universe.
That's right.
Yeah, there you go. So, yep, simple concept, folks. This is where we cover new and exciting albums by either new and exciting bands or old exciting artists that still don't get their due. What have you. So, Arturo, what album do you have in your queue here in the parallel universe this episode?
Hailing from the Netherlands, Personal Trainer was the musical vehicle for and is now the full-time, full-blown band centered around singer-songwriter Willem Smit in the parallel universe where rock music is still a popular worldwide, pop cultural force in pop music. Personal Trainer would be one of this year's breakout bands. The previous 3 years saw them release various singles and an EP on various European-based indie labels. However, this year, Los Angeles-based independent label Industry, that's the name of the label, Industry, put out their full-length debut album this year, Big Love Blanket. Several lazy reviews, including one in Mojo magazine, compared them extensively to Pavement. Now, while the essence of Pavement's snarky humor and ironically slacker exuberance certainly permeate throughout the record, the comparison is really off base. What Personal Trainer truly evoke is 1990s Britpop filtered through the prism of the poppier side of American indie rock. Think Blur meets Ben Queller, augmented by the more humorous side of Eels.
Yeah,
the album,
which is pretty good.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I like this album a lot. The album starts with the title track, a near a cappella intro that slams into The Laser, an amalgam of every great sing-along indie rock anthem you've ever heard. It's the best song Damon Albarn wishes he could have written. Rug Busters ends the album's excellent 1-2-3 punch with the best driving dance rock banger that James Murphy and LCD Sound System never produced. It's that good. Other great tracks, Key of Ego combines a throwdown grunge racket with a twisty prog rock song structure. The Money Department is the only song that vaguely resembles Pavement. And even then, it's less Stephen Malkmus and more Scott Canberg's lo-fi bubblegum.
Yeah.
And then you have a Valserberg Hero. Valserberg, I think, is a town in the Netherlands. But anyway, it recalls the melancholy indie jangle pop of early Silver Jews. Yes, you can play a game of spot the influence with Personal Trainer. But if you're into any of the bands and artists that I mentioned above, you will find that this band evokes them rather than regurgitates or flat out rips them off. In fact, I contend that this album, it's a refreshing, lighthearted, yet no less intelligent and heartfelt redefining of classic indie rock for the 21st century. That's what's going on here, I think. I like this album, and I'm excited to hear what Willem Smith does in the future. Chris?
Yeah, this is a testament to the fact that there's a difference between genre and idiom. Idiom in the sense that there is such a thing as 1990s indie rock, jangle pop, sort of inventive, pretty power punk, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, there is such a thing. It's interesting because, and I'll admit, I have to spend more time with this record. I mean, I took a couple of breezy listens to it just to get a sense of it, but just in terms of the melodies and the mood of it and kind of the energy of it, the first two bands I thought of were Fountains of Wayne and Archers of Loaf.
I can definitely hear Fountains of Wayne.
Yeah, Archers, I mean, that's a little bit more spurious, but it had that same kind of, you have that kind of like the taste of like warm chocolate milk in your mouth, kind of, it kind of had that. Eels is a good call in terms of the mood. Silver Jews is actually a pretty good call too, because it does have a little bit of that deadpan to it. So yeah, I mean, this is basically a tour back through the 90s. I was surprised to hear Mojo go there with the Pavement comparison, because like, where in the hell is that coming from? With the exception of some attitude and the fact that, yeah, okay, fine, the sort of the slacker white boy rock, we associate that with like 96, 97, and who was the face? Pavement. But that's a very lazy free association, and makes me wonder if the reviewers like 28 and only grew up with Pavement ex post facto. Yeah, so there you go. Now let's make a little bit of a switch. So months ago, was maybe like 6 months ago, 9 months ago on this show, you and I, it was actually on the same episode where we showered Big Thief with love.
Yeah.
We shit showered this one band. What was it? Black Country New Road.
Yeah.
We shit showered them with scorn, because their album is from this year is showing up on best of on some of these even like reputable magazines, and instead of like dick sucking like British like fanzines, they're showing up on top 10 lists. But what I'm covering this week is a testament that these like 7 or 8 piece collective artsy fartsy bad bands can have their slivers of magic, that they do have members. They might not be the maestro, or they might not be the artiste in the front, but they have their own thing going on. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about this band called Jockstrap. And this is a project of a member of Black Country New Road, Georgia Ellery, who turns out to be really, really compelling. Her shtick is basically electro. It's like EDM, R&B, and sunshine pop. The EDM is much better than the sunshine pop.
No shit.
Yeah, it's worth talking about. And one of the things about it is, over the next couple of months, at the end of every year, and it used not to be as big of an issue now, back then as it is now. It's for me, end of the year is always catch up. And it's kind of like, okay, what are the albums that people are talking about here at the end of the year? And so, okay, there were a lot of these albums that were showing up on a bunch of the lists. And there is one commonality with all of these except for Jockstrap. I mean, in terms of the European British stuff that was showing up on these lists, everything else, boring.
Yeah.
Really, really boring. There's a lot of fans of Fontaine's BC. I guess I can kind of understand that thematically, because they're Irish guys talking about being Irish and stuck in England.
Yeah.
Boring.
I think more than that, they suck ass. I can only count like 2 or 3 songs across 3 albums that I like.
Yeah, and then you got Alex G, who's okay. He's got chops, but he's also really boring.
He had a great album 8 years ago.
Yeah, back when he was Sandy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I can't even remember it off the top of my head, but like Mojo had an album that almost no one else had on their lists as their number one, and that's another boring
Yeah,
one too.
Michael Head and the Red Elastic Band. They are a band that no one outside the older generation of writers inside the Mojo offices know anything about.
Yeah, and they reminded me more of Big Head Todd and the Monsters than than anything. They're that kind of like kind of charming. What would you call them? Like pained pop, you know? Yeah, like pained, almost kind of sort of bar rock.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a little bit of an origin story why I'm covering Jockstrap, because they really do some compelling stuff. And so they're a duo. There's Georgia Ellery, like I said, she's a young gal who is in Black Country New Road. They're a bunch of art school grads, 2016, 2017 art school grads, as is she. But and then she has a friend, a guy named Taylor Sky, who does most of the programming and the electronics and a lot of the arrangement. But Georgia Ellery is a very good singer. She has a little bit of an R&B tinge, but she can also, and yeah, she ain't this good, but she can also kind of evoke the Beth Gibbons from Portishead and Tracy Thorn from Everybody But the Girl, kind of sultry, sort of chill house vocals. And so there's a few songs on here. Greatest Hits is the name of the song. It's a sexy, hooky little R&B tune. Has a real sensuous ambient electronic arrangement to it. And then there's a few songs at the end of the record that are really good. Glasgow, which is this really pretty harp and strings driven, almost like beach pop type of song. But in the middle, it has this sort of acoustic guitar and harmony breakdown that almost is evocative of like Zuma era Neil Young. It's kind of a really strange
but nowhere near as good.
Well, duh. I mean, believe me, I'm covering them because they're compelling and interesting and pretty good. Remember, that's the theme of this year, the year of the pretty good. And they're worth hearing. And I could see why people like them, because they do make a solid effort to be a little different. The title song actually is really good. The name of the album, by the way, is I Love You, Jennifer B. And then the title song, Jennifer B, is actually really good because it's this nice sort of, what would you call it? It's almost like an emotional pop, like an electro pop, almost noirish kind of feel to it about a friend, obviously named Jennifer B. And then the album ends with kind of an interesting, it's like almost, they call it an extended mix, but it might as well just be a remix of whatever it originally was. It's a very dancey song called 50/50, very club ready. Almost London house ready
arrangement. It's almost a techno track. I like it's the only song on the album I really, really like.
Yeah, it's almost like a more drum and bassy thing. Like think of like the Postal Service from 20-something years ago, and put a little bit more dubstep in it, or a little bit more drum and bass.
Put a little more grit, a little more soul, a little more balls.
Well, okay, yeah. In case anybody was wondering, Arturo really does not like Ben Gibbard. But no, so there are a lot of things to say about this record. The middle of it gets a little torch songy, which shows off her voice and shows off the more sort of like natural instrumentation chops of these two kids. But yeah, the more interesting stuff, it's kind of a sandwich where the first three or four songs are great. The last 3 or 4 songs are great. The middle of it, not so much. So great bread, lousy meat.
Yeah. I go a little step further. I think the very last track, 50/50, that's the one you're talking about. That's like a techno stomper. It's a great track. It's one of the best tracks, individual songs by anyone this year. It's probably not going to be a single. But aside from that, the rest of this album is caught between a polarity of two things. On one side, you have ADD indie pop, which is what a lot of young artists and musicians are now. They try to cram as much into one song as possible, killing all the space for the song, not allowing the song any air to breathe. You get that with a lot of contemporary young artists now. They just cannot settle on one beat, one melody, one rhythm at a time. They have to have like multiple chord changes and here and there and put as much in the mix as possible just so I can show off my skills. Like, settle down there, Beavis. All right,
Yeah, but to be fair, I mean, Black Country New Road, they do it very, very loudly.
Yeah,
and very, very obnoxiously.
exactly.
Whereas she does it kind of quietly and almost like she's going for an operatic suite.
Yeah, but she's still doing it nevertheless. And the other polarity that this band is caught with on the other side is, like you said, in the middle of the record, you have this 3-song streak of really, really dreary, dreadful Disney musical garbage. It's just so bad. Oh my God. Maudlin strings, overwrought vocals. It's just shitty melodies. Like, good Lord. Just stick to the techno stompers.
We wanted to give a quick shout out to an amazing music podcast you should definitely check out right after you listen to this episode. The Ringer's Rob Harvilla hosts 60 Songs That Defined the 90s. That's an audacious, ambitious title, and 75 songs in, the talented and often hilarious Harvilla is painting a rich, detailed, compelling take on that incredible decade. Wait, 75 songs? Yes, 75. Harvilla is 15 songs into the show's second season. Turns out there are 60 more songs that define the 90s. It's a clever concept, but it's one that Harvilla is executing beautifully, and he often makes the journey interactive, asking listeners to choose the song he'll cover in the next episode from a list he offers, and sometimes a write-in candidate wins. Such was the case when Harvilla covered The Verve's Bittersweet Symphony. So we strongly recommend 60 Songs That Define the 90s.
So this is a little bit exciting. We've been wanting to do an episode on the White Stripes for a little while. And as you can tell, there's a personal hook with us that their progression goes with our progression through our mid-20s into our early 30s. And they were really, really exciting at the time because nobody had heard a rock band that was that rock savvy and that rock reverent in a long time. And they really weren't a throwback. They were kind of anachronistic, but they were pushing things forward. So Arturo, talk to us a little bit about where they done come from and about their uprising before we get in, or their rise before we get into the albums.
Yeah, the story of Jack and Meg. It's quite possibly the last rock and roll story we will get that has any kind of mythic status, because a lot of most bands that call themselves rock bands out there are kind of boring. In fact, Meg White, post White Stripes, has been such an elusive figure that she's actually added to that myth. Of course, the way Jack and Meg played with the media during their time together certainly did not hurt in that regard. So, Jack Gillis and Meg White were both from Detroit, and they became high school friends when Jack would frequent the coffee shop Meg worked at. Shortly after high school, their relationship got more serious. Jack got a job as a furniture upholsterer, as you said, for his day job, and playing drums for a band called Goober and the Peas. The Detroit scene, the bands there had some great names. By the time Jack and Meg got married in 1996, Jack taking Meg's surname rather than the other way around, Jack was playing guitar in various bands such as The Henchmen, Two Star Tabernacle, and The Go. Now, I'm not sure if it's the same way today, but one thing about the Detroit music scene in the 1990s is that it was very incestual. It was quite common for musicians to ping pong back and forth from one band to another, often playing in different bands at the same time. Jack White was no stranger to this when he decided to, on a lark, do a duo band project with his wife Meg in 1997. Never having picked up an instrument before, she learned drums on the fly, and it led her to possess the simple meat and potatoes style of drumming that she became known for. They named the band the White Stripes. The concept of the White Stripes, both aesthetically and musically, was established from the very beginning. They would play primitive, basic, raw, garage rock steeped heavily in the blues, while having the attitude and amplitude of punk rock. Their visual style would be color coordinated in red and white, with red representing passion and anger, while the white would represent childlike purity and innocence. The overall overriding concept would be the idea of children discovering music for the first time, thereby approaching music making with a fresh, wide-eyed, incorruptible innocence. Hence their strategy of marketing themselves not as a husband and wife duo, but as brother and sister. Around this time, Jack also started to wean himself off the other bands he was involved with, especially the Go, who had just signed with Sub Pop Records, and began focusing on the White Stripes. They impressed Dave Buick, the owner of a tiny independent Detroit label called Italy Records, who approached Jack at a bar and offered to cover the expenses if the White Stripes would record 2 singles for him. The songs that resulted from this were Let's Shake Hands and Lafayette Blues, 2 scorching, scuzzy slices of garage rock heaven that earned them a bit of a buzz in the Detroit scene. This word-of-mouth buzz eventually reached Long Gone John, real name John Mermis, the head of the West Coast-based national independent label Sympathy for the Record Industry. Sympathy closed its proverbial doors back in 2007, but back in the 1990s, Long Gone John had a rather interesting strategy for selling records at the low-rent indie level. Basically, it was to specialize in 7-inch singles with only occasional EPs and full-length albums, occasionally, vastly, mostly singles. And these singles would be cheaply recorded, and he would cheaply record as many bands as possible, no matter how good or bad they were, and splatter independent record stores throughout the country with Sympathy for the Record Industry's cheap-ass CD singles. To be honest, most of the bands on Sympathy's roster sucked, but Long Gone John believed in throwing as many darts on the board as possible. Notable bands on his roster included at various times Hole, yes, Courtney Love in Hole, The Gun Club, toward the end of Jeffrey Lee Pierce's life, the Von Bondies, Rocket from the Crypt, Billy Childish, Suicide, Man or Astro Man, and Red Cross. He must have really liked the White Stripes because he allowed them to record a full-length album, albeit on a shoestring budget, and only given a couple of weeks in January 1999. The result was the White Stripes' self-titled debut album. But before we go into that, Chris, anything to say about the origins and the roots of the White Stripes?
Yes, I mean, you had an interesting point. The idea of where that sound and the concept comes from. There's there's the sexuality. Not only are you exploring music for the first time, but you're sort of exploring sexuality,
right,
and love for the first time. And really, what it comes down to is, hey, why did we all start loving rock and roll in the first place? Electric guitar and the beat. And so strip it down to its elements, and this band is, or at least was, for their first 4 records, was the electric guitar and the beat.
Yeah.
And, they sort of kept it that simple. The brother and sister thing, I thought was funny because you remember he used to introduce them even at the end. He's like, yeah, I'm Jack. This is my sister Meg, and he had that kind of phony bluesman thing. So they definitely kind of extended the great tradition of put on in rock and roll. There was a lot of put on and a lot of at least sort of mythic shtick. And then obviously we'll talk about this debut here in a sec. But once they get to their second album, they had figured out the concept beautifully in terms of not just the childlike innocence, but also sort of the deconstructive, taking the guitar out of the classic rock and then just putting it front and center.
Yeah.
The way that they did. So good stuff. So tell us, Arturo, about the next chapter in the history of the White Stripes.
Yeah, that debut album, the self-titled album, The White Stripes. It came out in 1999. By the late 1990s, there was a plethora of garage rock revival bands around the country operating in the indie underground. delivering low down, dirty, scuzzy, fuzzy, lo-fi, snarling rock and roll, most notably Mick Collins and his group, the Dirt Bombs, also from Detroit.
Yeah, good band.
But even among all of them, the White Stripes and their self-titled debut stood out. Their 1960s recalling pop art visual aesthetic and their postmodern conceptual presentation were enough to grab attention, but it wouldn't have mattered if the music wasn't transcendently great. They took all the sonic tropes of blues, garage rock, and punk and updated the blend for a new generation and repackaged them in a way that was quite innovative and original. The Big Three, Killed My Baby, is a barraging monster of a track that rages against the city's automotive Big Three car manufacturers, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, for outsourcing manufacturing jobs and contributing to Detroit's economic decline. Screwdriver is amphetamine blues taken to its breaking point. I Fought Piranhas simmers with boiling tension and explodes with its chorus. Even the covers are outstanding, with a riveting reinvention of Robert Johnson's Stop Breaking Down, a heavy as fuck version of Bob Dylan's One More Cup of Coffee, and a stomping version of Son House's Cannon. For almost any other band, this would be their best album. For the White Stripes, this was only the beginning of what would become a golden run of albums that would get better and better. It was also during the time of this album that the White Stripes got the first of several big breaks in their career. Whether it was fate or fortuitous serendipity, Pavement's touring manager at the time was looking for an opening act during a stretch of shows in the American South that included Georgia and North Carolina. Flipping through a pile of CDs by a bunch of unknown indie bands, she came across the unique candy-striped album cover of the White Stripes' debut album, played it, and fell in love with it so much that she reached out to the band and offered them the opening gig, opening for Pavement, right then and there. At this time in their career, Pavement were in a mellowed out phase, and they were touring for their laid-back final album, Terror Twilight. By all accounts, the White Stripes and their brand of white-knuckled rock and roll fury blew them off the stage night in and night out, to the point that Pavement themselves felt they had to up their ante and make their set rock out more, just so they could compete.
Sure.
The White Stripes' success on this mini tour was such that it opened the doors for them to go out on the national touring circuit. Soon after, the hype would start. FYI, I got this story from the, as of now, 2-part podcast miniseries published by Jack White's Third Man Records. It's called Striped, the story of the White Stripes. I recommend any of you out there who are White Stripes fans to go check it out. Chris?
Yeah. So the first record, very raw. And you can tell it was like they were still kind of figuring out how to record and produce and those types of things. Because, man, the guitar is Godzilla. But sometimes Jack is kind of like down here in the mid. It's like it's almost like the guitar is swallowing the rest of the track.
Yeah.
And which is not necessarily a bad thing. And it's kind of funny that the first sounds, Jack White is treated as a god and Meg is treated as an afterthought. The first sound you hear on the record is an almost like Motownish old school drum break at the beginning of Jimmy the Exploder. So, which is one of the better songs on the record. It's aptly named too, because it does explode. And I think that they showed what they had and the sort of the intellectual power of what they were doing too, I think comes across in the cover of One More Cup of Coffee, which, on Desire, Bob Dylan's Desire from 76 is a very dramatic, very almost cinematic, evocative of Westerns. You've got Jacques Levy's violin going. You've got harmonies with Emmylou Harris. It almost sounds like sort of a haunted country song. One cup of more cup of coffee here strips all of it away and gets to the sort of the almost the gallows humor of that song.
Yeah,
and it makes it more stark and more what would you call it? Almost macabre.
Yeah.
In a way, I think, Dylan was sort of doing this sort of really sort of dark and sort of, again, sort of gallows humor ballad, and maybe getting away with it with like a pretty arrangement. Whereas Jack takes away, and Meg, they take away all the pretty and just leave you with the dire.
Yeah.
Which, and I really like on that. And so, yeah, really strong stuff here. I've always been a big fan of, again, Jimmy the Exploder and the Big Three Killed My Baby.
Yeah.
Those songs are just awesome to just kind of feel it. So you had a feeling, who knew what was coming next? I mean, they could have just kept doing that.
Right.
And with a little bit more refinement would have been great. But nope. Jack White got more confident and more focused, and as they went along, a year and a half later, they came out with something absolutely astonishing. Tell us about that, Arturo.
Yeah. Their second album, For Sympathy for the Record Industry, in 2000, Distill, was the first of, and Distill, by the way, it's Dutch. It's Dutch for the style. It was the first of 3 consecutive masterpieces that would place the band in the vanguard of modern rock at the time as, in my opinion, the saviors of rock and roll, and make them arguably the band of the decade. For Jack White, it was the album where he would stretch his wings musically as well as stylistically as a songwriter. Folk, country, and even vaudeville pop would enter the White Stripes' sonic stew and bolster Jack's lyrical vision. It was really a giant leap forward for him as a venerable songwriter with a classic sensibility that somehow still felt modern and timeless all at once. It was almost their last album. Shortly after the White Stripes finished recording all the songs for Distill in early 2000, Jack and Meg White divorced. Understandably, Jack thought that was the end of the band, and for what was the band's final booked show at a Detroit lounge bar, Jack got a couple of his old music scene buddies to play with him. Surprisingly, on the day of the show, Meg convinced Jack that the White Stripes should continue, and they went on from there. So, yes, Jack and Meg managed to do something most people would find impossible. They not only remained friends after divorcing, but they stayed together as a band.
Wow.
Don't ask me to ponder how the hell that worked out for them. But anyway, if whatever problems Jack and Meg were having at the time bled into the music, it sure as hell resulted in one of the most powerful rock albums of the decade of the noughties. The stop-start dynamic of the single Hello Operator recalls the blues rock bravado of early Led Zeppelin. In one of the rare examples where a cover is better than the original, the White Stripes version of Son House's Death Letter Blues, as House's version is called, is one of the most exhilarating performances of electric blues in the 21st century, and over the years it became a White Stripes standard. Let's Build a Home roars with a ferocity that few bands could match, not even now. As noted earlier, Jack's growth as a songwriter and song stylist supreme is evident with the endearing pop perfection of Apple Blossom and I'm Bound to Pack It Up, which lifts the acoustic riff and chord progression from the Marshall Tucker Band's Can't You See and reinvents it all as a beautiful folk blues lament. The second major break for the White Stripes as a touring act came this year also when they opened for Sleater-Kinney during Sleater-Kinney's Fall 2000 tour. Around this time, Sleater-Kinney were the premier American indie rock band, and opening for them built on the minor buzz from the previous year, and with music critics' antenna lifted, that minor buzz became a major buzz as the White Stripes started to become the most talked about underground band in the country. Can you imagine being in the audience in 2000, seeing Sleater-Kinney at the peak of their powers, and right before them, seeing a young, explosive White Stripes? Yowza.
Oh, and that must have just been an unbelievable show. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like, dude, I can't even imagine. Like, I would like
gladly get back in the DeLorean and hit 88 and just go see that, because that must have just been a dream show.
Yeah.
Like,
White
imagine,
Stripes at their peak, Slater Kinney at their peak.
oh my goodness. So I love this style.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that you didn't talk about, and that I think is important for us to talk about, is the steel. The steel, really, it was a Dutch artistic movement that started in the 1910s and extended into the 1930s, and it was built on the notion of abstraction, the idea. And so the idea is they reduced, or they only allowed, these painters, the idea is we're rejecting this sort of richness and sort of overwrought art. And we're only allowed to use black and white and primary colors and shapes. And so lots of triangles and rectangles and all of that. But it was a minimalist artistic movement. And so they were making that connection between that artistic movement and their shtick, which, obviously the red and the white and the black, and the just sort of very simple, essentially, if you think about it, they were playing with the primary colors of Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
And I think that that's pretty clear. And so there's just a lot of really great stuff. And I think like the fullest song on it, in terms of the most kind of that has the most underneath, is probably You're Pretty Good Looking.
Yeah.
The album opener. But the rest of it, like you said, Hello Operator and I'm Bound to Pack It Up, and some of the stuff, Jumble Jumble, it's a lot of it it's kind of like this jumping, really spare, just sort of Jack getting all the space in the world to just Axeman it and just crank.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's this joyful noise, but also just that has this sort of spitting fire of lead work. And again, it's taut. It's very mixed around the blues, and it's meditative after a while, because again, it's just beat and guitar, and it just draws you in.
Yeah.
And it's just an album to bop to.
Yeah.
I just think it's an extraordinary record. I mean, I love the fact that they end it with Blind Willie McTell.
Yeah. Your Stuck in His Mind, a song about domestic abuse.
Yeah, but with acoustic, kind of acousticy, kind of almost Mississippi Delta instrumentation, which is separate from the rest of the record. So it's almost kind of like a wink wink kind of joke to end it. One thing I will say is I personally think the best song on this album is Apple Blossom, which is just this beautiful kind of throwback, almost. I don't know if it's country, but it's almost like a folk song.
Yeah, it is.
Which Quentin Tarantino picked up, that in the non-Pulp Fiction division of his discography, the best use of popular music in any of his movies is when he uses Apple Blossom at near the beginning of The Hateful Eight.
Yeah.
Which is, you have this sort of, lyrics about adoring a woman and wanting to, come to her rescue and be there for her. Well, meanwhile, the only female character in the movie turns out to be the bad guy, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, but she spends 2.5 hours basically getting beaten up and abused physically and verbally.
Right.
So in a way, one, it's perfect for the scene because you're in 1880s snowy Wyoming, and so it's kind of a perfect aesthetic. But the lyrics, there's almost like kind of a dark, cruel joke to it, as well. So, but like I said, you can't really objectively call it their best record because of it's not. I think the accomplishment of a couple of the records that came after this are more impressive in terms of the technical stuff that they were able to pull off.
Right.
But this record, as a statement, as a concept, as an exercise, and as really a discipline, that's what it is it's like they came up with a very simple and very narrow path, like basically just, the still movement in rock and roll, and they stuck to it and they pulled it off. Again, Jimmy Page without the other three guys.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
rich eclecticism to this record too,
sure.
stylistically. That's what impresses me most about it. It's not all
Yeah,
bare bone, scuzzy, fuzzy rock. There's a lot to
yeah.
it too. There's a lot of textures on this record as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, and it's kind of like you and West End. That was a good pointer, Terry, because it's not like all whole lot of love. It's like whole lot of love followed by like Bronjar Stomp, followed by like Kashmir.
Yeah,
Yeah, it has that kind of sweep to it.
I,
So
I like that idea. Jimmy Page with either you or me on drums.
yeah, I mean that's it. It's yeah, it's Jimmy Page. Oh, what the hell? Get a metronome. You don't even need a human being. It's
Yeah.
yeah, really. It's just, and that's what kind of makes it extraordinary. And one of my favorite records of the era, for sure.
Yeah.
And remember, they were supporting, as far as I know, that show that we talked about in the opening. They didn't play anything from the old record, from from the next record,
Right.
that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
From what I remember, it was mostly stuff from the Steel, which they were supporting, and they did a really great cover of Jolene by Dolly Parton.
Right. Yeah. Well, they're
Where
known for that. Yeah.
yeah, which is, it's the same thing as One More Cup of Coffee, which is to take the dark humor out of the mix and just really like kind of play up the darkness.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
anyway,
Speaking of exceptional, the next album is White Blood Cells from 2001. Now, one of the marks of historically great rock bands is that they have counterparts. If not arch enemies, then doppelgangers, if you will. The yangs to their yings, The Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath. The Sex Pistols, The Clash. U2, REM. Nirvana, Pearl Jam. Oasis, Blur. The White Stripes certainly had theirs, and that band was The Strokes. By early 2001, the music media hype surrounding the White Stripes was hitting a fever pitch, and it perfectly coincided time-wise with the music media hype enveloping The Strokes, a scruffy, gritty New York City band riding high off the critical success of their gnarly rockin' debut EP, The Modern Age. Whereas the White Stripes brand of garage rock was deeply steeped in classic blues, 1960s garage rock and punk attitude, the Strokes shared only the punk attitude. Musically, the Strokes came from a more 1970s CBGB's New York art punk sensibility mixed with a little 1990s lo-fi indie rock a la Guided by Voices. Either way, both of these bands blowing up at the same time was a stark contrast to what was popular in rock at the time, which was stuck between a polarity of mostly terrible nu metal, Korn, Limp Bizkit, Stained, etc., and progressive art rock, Radiohead, The Flaming Lips, etc. It was refreshing as hell, and it harkened back to exactly 10 years prior when Nirvana was shifting the rock landscape. It was in this historical context that the White Stripes unveiled their third album, their second consecutive masterpiece, and their commercial breakthrough album, White Blood Cells. Whereas the previous album, Distill, reveled in a stylistic variety that augmented their patented scuzz and noise, White Blood Cells was a monolithic sledgehammer directly aiming for both your head and your crotch. It was the closest Jack and Meg would ever get to heavy metal. The following year, after the White Stripes signed to V2 Records, a subsidiary of major label Virgin, the album was re-released, and Fell in Love with a Girl was their breakthrough single on rock radio. The kinetic, feverish, 100-mile-an-hour adrenaline rush of the song was a thrill to hear on radio at the time, and it's amazing the song wasn't a bigger hit. The opening track, Dead Leaves on the Dirty Ground, is one of rock's greatest opening songs with its pummeling sludge assault. The stylistic eclecticism that Jack White showed in his songwriting on the previous album hadn't gone away, though, and it was showcased by the rollicking country jaunt of a Hotel Yorba and the gorgeous folk ballad We're Going to Be Friends. Surprising influences also pop up in the album, where one can hear the raw power and savage emotion of early PJ Harvey on tracks like Expecting and The Union Forever. I Can't Wait has a strutting chorus reminiscent of mid 1970s Queen, and the instrumental Aluminum is straight up sludge metal. It's a riveting album from start to finish. And when Rolling Stone magazine placed the album at number 497 in their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time back in 2012, they were actually underselling it. It's also important to note that during the White Blood Cells period, their third huge big break came in the form of John Peel and his BBC radio show. When the album came out in the summer of '01, Peel constantly played tracks from the album and from the first two White Stripes albums, opening the door to their ensuing massive popularity in the UK and Europe. Chris?
Yep, and they did a lot of touring over there.
Yeah.
Very prolific. So Jack White, if you read interviews with him, is a pretty self-conscious, restless guy. And he's not one of these guys who's content to find the formula and keep knocking it out of the park, or just to keep, this made me, so I'm going to reinvent it and reinvent it and reinvent it.
Right.
No, I think that, I think he understood that to steal as a conceptual feat, there was a cleverness to it and all that, but that's what kind of got them their appeal and their buzz. And so now he's like, okay, they're expecting us to do that again. I don't really want to do that again. I don't want to get pigeonholed as sort of this blues, this deconstructive blues rock act. Yeah. And then I've read interviews where he says this, where it just, that's where this desire to crank it up and to explore different contours comes from. And so that is where the noise and the fury and even more the more gentle stuff. He wanted to make a pop record with White Blood Cells, essentially, like just like a straightforward like rock record where it kind of has those sort of way over the top kind of like bash outs. And then these like kind of softer songs, and then with a couple of sticky songs mixed in. You mentioned Dead Leaves on the Dirty Ground and Hotel Yorba. Well, the album starts, there certainly was not, and you made this point, there certainly was not another band or another album in 2001 that started anywhere close to that riff. Yeah. I think that when I first heard that, I was like, whoa, it's one of those, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but what's coming to mind is like, Smells Like Teen Spirit or the beginning, Let Me Drown from Super Unknown. It's like this riff that immediately hits you in the mush and kind of like, whoa, kind of jaw dropping. But then Hotel Yorba follows that. And it's like this 1, 2, 3, 4, just this like, which by the way was, I saw them at Coachella in 2003 and they played that live. That's a fun live song because like Meg, God bless her heart, she could barely keep up with that beat. I mean, you could, well, it was 105 degrees out there. So you could tell she's dying while she's trying to play that. But there's some other stuff on there. Like I said, I've always been a huge fan of the Union Forever because it does have this kind of like 1970, 71 kind of throwback of like, think about like the sort of the cocky drugged out frontman thing of like, I don't know, Iggy Pop or Jim Morrison or this sort of, almost like shouty, like over dramatic thing. And then you get that little spoken word thing in the middle with just the taps of the drums.
Quoting Citizen Kane.
Yeah, exactly. Quoting Citizen Kane. And so there's a pretension to it, but it's so charming in the middle of that whole thing. It's I'm a huge fan of this record. I think that, the production from here, White is sort of, because again, he's kind of I don't know if he's Asperger's or something, but he's like one of these guys that when he gets focused on something, really focuses. And so he's starting to get clever with his production techniques, which obviously that manifests itself most strongly on the next two records after this, in terms of how he recorded them. But this one just blasts out of the fucking speakers. So like you said, this is just a moonshot, and they deserved their props because again, I think now that I think about it, if they had come around 10 years earlier, they might not have been as well perceived because there were a whole lot of bands that were, either they would have just been like a bandwagon signing and would have gotten a couple of hits and that's all we remember. But they came out in the right time because, like you said, you had new metal on the one end. You had sort of almost like crappy like gangsta rap on the other. Like the kind of the post, corrupt and all the kind of the Master P kind of shit. And so they were the only guys that were doing anything like remotely interesting rock balls-ish at the time. So so good stuff.
On this episode, Chris and I broke down the greatness of the music and legacy of the White Stripes. For the next episode, we're going to provide an end-of-year treat, the best albums of 2022. No parallel universe segment this time, folks. Yours truly, Curmudgeons, are staying in the real world this time, and each of us will give our picks for the top 10, or even top 20, albums of this year, while we give each other feedback on our picks. There will be some agreement, but there will also be some serious disagreement, especially with a few of Chris's picks. Good God Almighty. If anything, we hope this episode will encourage you all out there to listen to some of the actual good music that came out this year, instead of the corporate pop mediocrity referred to you by the likes of Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, or Spin. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you the best albums of 2022. Speaking of rock ballsish, when the White Stripes released Elephant on April Fool's Day 2003, the anticipation leading up to it matched what Radiohead had for Kid A in 2000 and what Nirvana and Pearl Jam had just a decade before for their follow-ups to their classic breakthrough albums. Now, did the White Stripes live up to the hype? A resounding hell yes. Elephant stands as the White Stripes' third consecutive masterpiece and is generally regarded as their greatest album. It's also their most commercially successful album, spawning the blockbuster international hit single Seven Nation Army, Jack White's signature song, and to this day, a pop music standard that has endured for multiple generations of rock music fans. Seriously, if you don't know the song by that thumping bass line, dun, 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 dun. If you don't know that, you've been living under a rock for the last 19 years.
Right. And you probably will never come anywhere close to listening to this podcast.
Exactly. It's a flawless, beautifully flowing record that takes all the musical and songwriting strides the band had made with their previous albums and coalesces them into a perfect rock and roll whole. Other great tracks, The Hardest Button to Button, with its stop-start dynamic, grooves and struts with a menace and the confidence of a band hitting their absolute peak. I'm no fan of Burt Bacharach, but the White Stripes' passionate version of I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself ranks as one of the greatest cover versions that anyone has ever done and blows away the original. Black Math merges speedy punk, almost hardcore punk, with a Black Sabbath-style bridge. Songs like The Air Near My Fingers and the gorgeous I Want to Be the Boy Who Warms Your Mother's Heart epitomize Jack White's gift for incorporating electric keyboards into the mix with his patented fuzz guitars without watering down the music at all. Overall, this is the album that saw the White Stripes vault past the Strokes, and every other band for that matter, in the garage rock revival sweepstakes and establish them as the definitive rock band of the noughties, at least the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. One thing about the enduring timelessness of Seven Nation Army, several years ago in an interview, Jack was asked about how he felt about the song being played in sports stadiums throughout the world with people singing along to that immortal bass line. Not too surprisingly, Jack enthused that it was the ultimate compliment, claiming that the song's status as a sports stadium anthem is, quote, what makes it folk music. Now, when Jack said folk music, he didn't mean hairy guys playing acoustic guitars.
Right.
He meant folk music in the sense of music of the people. Music
Common experience.
Exactly. Yeah. Music that is so ingrained in social consciousness that it never goes away. Well, Elephant, as an all-time classic rock album, will never go away, and neither will the White Stripes' status as arguably the best rock band of the 21st century. Chris?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always thought that the neatest thing about both Seven Nation Army and The Hardest Button to Button is that's not bass.
Yeah, it's a guitar.
Yeah.
I think it's a baritone guitar that he's playing.
Yeah, and it's it's baritone guitar at the end. It kind of like mirrors a bass, but it's all sort of guitar. Kind of. He's at that point he's a guitar maestro, and so it's kind of guitar maestro like technical stuff.
Yeah.
I said before that he gets to the point where he's really, really innovative. So now this record is recorded on an analog 8-track recording setup. But he's still using all of his modern day, pedals and add-ons and, whatever the sort of the modern guitar setup is. And so it's almost like digital effects being recorded by like a 40-year-old 8-track console. And so that's where you kind of get this, it sounds like it was made in the vinyl era. It sounds like the kind of album that would have been like literally cut up on the floor.
Right.
It ain't no Pro Tools going on with this record.
Yeah.
And actually back then everybody liked to pick on Pro Tools. Remember when we defended Saint Anger, that was the problem everybody had, which is bullshit, because Pro Tools is supposed to be able to make you do like shtick you can't do and is supposed to help you invent. But anyway, I digress. This album is fantastic. I love The Hardest Button to Button, the most surrealist take on domestic life imaginable.
Yeah.
I also, and again, there was a certain amount of shtick, and I with their cover choices, and some of it, again, it's that deconstructive thing or finding the pain in this. But I think that the idea of covering I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself is like rescuing it from all the lacquer and the schmaltz of what was it? I think Dionne Warwick did a version of it, but basically Burt Bacharach doing Burt Bacharach. And so, having a little bit of a some rockabilly style strumming on the chorus or on the verses is kind of a clever, almost pretty good musical, like pop music vocabulary joke. If you think about it, like doing that to a Burt Bacharach song. So, obviously Seven Nation Army is immortal. I think a lot of people, if you ask mainstream critics and you said, what's the best single of the decade or of the 2000s?
The
best rock song. Well, not only that, but in the entire 2000s, they would probably pick Seven Nation Army. Maybe not the best song overall. There's a few others, like All Right by Kendrick Lamar and Formation by Beyonce and a couple of Kanye tracks, or He Who Shall Not Be Named anymore. And then obviously there's a couple of Wilco songs, etc. There's a few that you can come up with, or like, Kelly Clarkson, Since You Had Been Gone. But rock songs, it would be Seven Nation Army. And it is extraordinary that I'm looking at Spotify right now. Here's the number of streams to date of Seven Nation Army: 1,189,269,542.
Jeez.
So 1.2 billion plays on Spotify for a rock song released after 2000. That don't happen too much, if at all. But, I said, that's just a neat song. It's like one of the more creative riffs of all time, and like unforgettable. I mean, there's a reason why they would take that into sports stadiums, because it really does kind of sound like Warhorse shit, doesn't it?
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
It's a marching on your horse, getting ready for battle. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And honestly, I think you said it, it almost has a Tony Iommi kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
With that part of bottom heavy kind of angular riff going on to it. So I'm also a big fan of Ball and Biscuit.
That's one of the best pure blues songs the Stripes ever did.
Oh yeah, and it's certainly of the ones he wrote. Like that and Hello Operator are probably the two best. But they hadn't really done that. I mean, remember they took the album, they took the White Blood Cells off from that. So to hear it come back like that, and then of course, then you kind of get the like White kind of had this alternate persona of like maybe he thought he had like the worst fake Southern accent, or the worst fake kind of Texas troubadour accent ever. I remember he tried to do that on stage. And so maybe like, girl, you have no faith in medicine is like the embodiment of that persona.
Yeah.
But anyway, like I said, just a really fun record, really well engineered, incredibly well played. And the songwriting is top notch, especially the hardest button to button. I mean, that song is extraordinary.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, I think it's the best song they ever wrote.
All right. Their next album from 2005, Get Behind Me, Satan. And
very underrated.
Well, I was going to say, and here we get the White Stripes' first folly. Listen, I get it. After climbing to the top of the mountain with a certain formula, I understand an artist's desire to do something different and experiment. In fact, we should all encourage it. Just don't expect the end result to always be good. In fact, this reflects one of this podcast's curmudgeonly tenets. Just because something is new or different or unique doesn't mean it's automatically good.
Right.
In the case of the White Stripes and their fifth album, Get Behind Me, Satan, the end result is definitely mixed. Acoustic guitars, pianos, and exotic instruments like the marimba dominate the musical arrangements on this album, and it would have been great if Jack White's songwriting were a little more consistently solid. Passive manipulation and take are attempts at folk rock and lyrically try to explore the nuances of codependent relationships, but are just awkward and clumsy in their construction and their forgettable vocal melodies. The Nurse is a misguided attempt at noisy art pop and proof that marimbas should be kept to a minimum in rock settings.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yet this is a White Stripes album, so it's impossible for it to be a total stinker. Blue Orchid rocks furiously with a sleek, processed in a good way buzzsaw guitar. The piano stompers, My Doorbell, and the Denial Twist are the closest the White Stripes ever got to 1960s style R&B and soul. Little Ghost showed what was, at the time, the duo's increasing ease and comfort with Appalachian folk music. And I'm Lonely, But I Ain't That Lonely Yet is a wry, clever country ballad. Overall, it's an album that has some great songs, but is far from a great album. Chris?
Yeah, the reason I said that this album is underrated is some of the stuff that you had said. That I think that what it was is that at that point, remember, they had become huge.
Yeah.
And there was this expectation of, okay, we want you to come and bash out and be like the guitarist in the cage on stage. And we take you around the country like King Kong. I think that White was a little burned out on that. And so I think that the idea of let's stick to the White Stripes concept of the sort of the childlike innocence or the deconstructive, pull out of the beat and basically the riff or whatever, and to do it with acoustic guitar and piano and to delve into folkier, more sort of, ditty territory, almost like countryish ditty territory with, I'm a big fan of My Doorbell. I think that's a really cool song. The fact that you have a White Stripes album that really, what is it? Basically like only 2 songs on the whole thing that have that traditional bash out. I think it's like Instinct Blues and Red Rain, and the rest of it is off there. I'm a big fan of, there's some really great sort of lament like dirge ballads on this thing. For Forever for Her is Over for Me is a really terrific kind of somber, almost breakup song. And I'm also a big fan of As Ugly as I Seem. And also, like you said, I'm Lonely, But I Ain't That Lonely.
Yeah.
That has that verse on it about his sister, which makes me think that's a thinly veiled reference to his divorce from Meg.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it makes me think. But like you said, just the fact that they were able to kind of replace the electric guitar bombast with guitars and little, with acoustic guitars and piano and again, marimba. You should probably, that should be kept to a minimum. But the fact that even they pulled back on some of the big drums and replaced it with like tambourines and maracas and
and stuff like that. Just the fact that they changed things up, but were still kind of true to themselves, I think is impressive.
The next album is the sixth and final White Stripes album, Icky Thump, from 2007, their first and only album for Warner Brothers after the V2 label was consolidated after the Virgin Company was purchased. And it was their highest charting album in the US, going to number 2 on the Billboard chart. This album sees the White Stripes pulling off the neat trick of looking backward. The scorching blues rock numbers Catch Hell Blues and Bone Broke are outtakes from their debut album, and also looking forward with some of their most experimental sounds. Unlike the previous album, Get Behind Me, Satan, most of the sonic adventurousness on Icky Thump, I think, works. Prickly Thorn but Sweetly Worn is an inspired take on revved up Scottish folk music with a droning bagpipe to boot. But it then sails into exotic weirdness when the track segues into St. Andrew. This battle is in the air, a 4/4 rhythm stomp with backwards tape loops, the bagpipe turning over dissonant chords, and Meg White's spoken word vocals. It's one of the strangest and oddly most exciting moments on any White Stripes record. Of course, the best track on the album is the title track, which also happened to be one of the band's biggest hit singles, Icky Thump, reaching the top 30 of the Billboard singles chart and as high as number 2 in the UK. It's also one of the strangest songs to ever be a big rock radio hit, with this haunting, menacing bass drum driven rhythm. Jack White employs a clavioline, which is an old electronic keyboard instrument that was the precursor to the synthesizer, and he uses it to riveting effect as its melody lines swirl all over the song until it hits the chorus with a heavy, hairy, hard rock riff straight out of the 1970s. It's akin to Led Zeppelin trying to cover the Beatles' Baby You're a Rich Man.
Pretty much.
It's also the most political song the White Stripes ever did.
Oh, by far.
With Jack excoriating right-wing immigration policies and xenophobia with the sneering lines, "White Americans, what? Nothing better to do? Why don't you kick yourself out? You're an immigrant too." Not all the experiments work. Conquest, with its obnoxious vocal melody and clumsy song structure, is proof that unless you're Calexico, you should never mix mariachi trumpets with rock. Rag and Bone is just silly and goofy with its narrative about picking up random things at a junkyard. But it ends on a great note with songs such as the epic organ rocker, I'm Slowly Turning Into You, and with what is usually a White Stripes album, or was usually a White Stripes album closing tradition, catchy sing-along folk with effect and cause. It's an album that saw the White Stripes creatively back on the right track until midway through their fall North American tour in 2007. They canceled all remaining tour dates due to Meg White reportedly suffering from acute anxiety. The band went on hiatus, with Jack recording and playing with his side bands, the Raconteurs and the Dead Weather, before the duo reconvened in 2009 to write and record new material. Unfortunately, the magic didn't seem to be there anymore between Jack and Meg, as the sessions ended soon after they started. And 2 years later, in 2011, Jack and Meg White announced that the White Stripes had officially, yet amicably, broken up. Chris?
Yeah, it's unfortunate what happened to Meg. I mean, the idea of having to, be the number 2 in a band where people perceived it as this genius and this dope, and not getting the respect for some of the contributions, like some of the vocal stuff that she did. And from what I've read, she had veto power, that she had influence. The idea of I don't want this song on this record because I don't like this lyric. And so 2 albums later, it shows up, those kinds of things. And so, it wasn't just a Jack White vanity project to torture his ex-wife, and so there's that. This album's kind of neat in the sense that, you're right. I do kind of admire the fact that he's going for some Western, like Southwestern and Mexican rhythms, and some almost like movie Western kind of stuff. But like you said, the mariachi trumpets are a little bit much.
I will say this, and you alluded to this, is they kind of loop back around. The kind of the neat thing about the journey through these 6 albums in their discography is with Catch Hell Blues and Effect and Cause, they end where they started.
Yeah.
Like Effect and Cause is again, I mean, well, Catch Hell Blues and Effect and Cause, they're back to paying tribute to Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
and Effect and Cause is interesting because it's like the first hint of Robert Plant influence
Yeah.
in that Zeppelin mix too. Because
Sure.
before it was just, let's take the Jimmy Page and fuck the other 3 guys. Now it's like all of a sudden it's Jack White doing an impression of Robert Plant.
Yeah.
Which
Jack
which
White's gone on record saying that he doesn't trust anyone who doesn't like Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust anybody that doesn't like Led Zeppelin either.
Yeah.
That, or the Beatles. I mean, people that say, I don't really like the Beatles. I'm like, get the fuck out.
Yeah. Come on.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess this is a good place to share a quote that Jack White did an interview with Vulture earlier in 22 to promote the 2 records that he just came out with. One of which, by the way, is awesome. Was it Fear of the Dawn? I think it's called.
See, that album, I think it sounds good. The single from that album is fantastic. It's the best song he's done in years. But I said, what brings that album down for me, even though it has the bombast, I just don't think his songwriting is consistently good anymore. It's just not there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's not consistent, but like it consistently rocks balls. I mean, it's like the most rockin' sounding record I heard this year. I mean, it jumps out of the speakers.
Yeah. But like, sonically, it sounds great. I just don't think the songs are there for the most part.
Yeah, and it just kind of shows, like Jack White, just kind of how strange and eccentric he is. That like he'll say things, and then you're like, but wait a second. And here's one of those quotes where he says, quote, "I want songs to live in a bigger universe, and you can take them to different directions, and you can drag something out, and you can slow them down, and you can speed them up. Then they've got some life to them that they can live in for a long time." And yeah, I mean, I guess maybe in the original design, that's kind of a concept for him to write songs. But I mean, let's face it, dude, is he ever going to do like a bash out, like speed metal version of Seven Nation Army? I mean, is he ever going to do like a John Lee Hooker, like real slow stomping blues version of Seven Nation Army?
Yeah.
No, he's going to do Seven Nation Army.
Right.
And he also, in the same interview, he laments, and I feel sorry for the people that have big hit singles that they have to play the same way over and over and over and over again. I'm like, but that's kind of what you ended up having to do, right, dude?
Yeah, exactly. Here's the thing, like, after the White Stripes, like, I'm not a big fan of any of the music Jack White has done post White Stripes. Like the Raconteurs have one pretty good album, the 2008 record, Consolers for the Lonely. That album rocks. I like that. And the songwriting is good. It's the last album that Jack White was a part of where the songwriting was solid and consistent. The Dead Weather are pretty terrible.
They're bad.
They're really bad. And to me, his stuff under the Jack White moniker is just really underwhelming. Really just not that good. Yeah, I respect that he's experimenting with sounds and styles, and he went into an electro quasi hip hop direction with that album he did in 2018. Okay, I mean, I respect the willingness to try new things, but like I said, don't expect it to be all good. And in Jack White's case, most of it post Stripes is not that good. Here's the thing: post White Stripes, do you know what Jack White's biggest contribution to the music industry is?
What's that?
His record label, Third Man Records.
And he produced a Loretta Lynn record.
That was in 2004. But Third Man Records was really a big part of the vinyl record revival of the 2010s.
Oh, absolutely.
So post White Stripes, that is Jack White's, his second biggest legacy is his record label and how it contributed to the vinyl revival in the teens, the 2010s.
Yeah, and it's kind of a charming label, and they do some things. I mean, the most striking thing is, he has a little studio in Nashville, and he has one of those old school booths where you could basically make your own acetate.
Yep.
Where you just kind of do that, and Neil Young recorded an entire album using that booth.
but he was doing covers of like 70s soft rock things like Gordon Lightfoot songs and or like I think he did a cover like This Land Is Your or This Land Is Your Land, and stuff like that. But he did it all in that acetate booth, which is kind of funny. Now Jack White's, like you said, Jack White's post White Stripes journey is interesting. I actually like the Raconteurs because I'm a big Brendan Benson fan. I think that guy is one of the better pop songwriters on the planet. Or at least was back then. So I give him a pass for that. I mean, it wasn't necessarily his comfort zone, but I thought that he did some good contributions for there. But wouldn't you know it, the best stuff in his solo catalog is the stuff that most evokes the White Stripes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the cover of I'm Shakin'.
Yeah.
Which I know when I lived in White Plains, New York, the rock station there, which is one of the best in the world, WXPK, The Peak. Got to give a shout out to The Peak. They still think the Smithereens and Squeeze are like in the top 10. Yeah, great station. But they used to play I'm Shakin' all the time, and that was great. And that was really a clever take on that. But he's credit him for it's that same restless spirit. I mean, he'll never do the same thing twice.
Right.
And he does have that self-consciousness. And like like this year where he did the 2 records thing that some people do, where he did the loud record and the soft record.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The soft record's got better songs on it, but it's more sort of meh. It's
middle-aged man folk rock.
It's middle-aged man. Happily married father rock. Like middle, like swaying. It's like almost like AOR rock from the AO rock, soft rock from the cities, or AO. What am I trying to say? AOR rock, like Gordon Lightfoot, James Taylor kind of stuff from the 70s.
He's on his third wife now, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He hopefully he gets off her. No, exactly. He's been married 3 times now, and he. There's a contentment there, but I think that the fact that he goes from like kind of a bash out, unsettled record to a domesticated, more sort of soft ballad record kind of shows you that he'll never stop trying to, he'll never stop throwing darts at the dartboard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And he's not afraid to hit or miss. Now, granted, as he gets older and as he gets happier, there's a lot more miss than there used to be, which is the whole point of this episode, that those 6 albums that we just described. I mean, the worst of them is arguably Get Behind Me, Satan.
Yeah.
But which is, to me, a great record.
Right.
I would say that that's a 3.5 to 4-star record that's got some really compelling stuff on it. And so if your worst record is a 4-star record, that's a pretty good run.
Yeah. So speaking on that, so we're going to end it on this. You've talked a bit about, post White Stripes, Jack White. So the name of this episode is The White Stripes, A Legacy. Chris?
Yeah. Why do they have the legacy?
What is the legacy?
What is the legacy of the White Stripes? I would say basically they are the last of their kind.
Yeah.
In the sense of that they were a reverent blues, folk, and country rock garage type of band that had a prominent place on radio,
right.
could play festivals, that had reverence, that had a goofy lead singer who could date actresses like Renee Zellweger, that had a mythos to them that people cared about. And the fact that they did have a pristine riff that shows up in football stadiums all over the country.
Yeah.
I think they're the last of their breed.
Yeah.
So I think that's their legacy.
Yeah.
One, the fact that they were so intelligent about, taking rock to the roots of the essence of its roots, and their deconstruction experiments, the idea of little kids doing their bright-eyed take on rock and roll, and being sweet on one end and sour on the other, but never dishonest.
Right.
Never. Yeah. The idea is, so you strip away all the bullshit and find the essence of what you're trying to say, bash out. And
I think that's their legacy, that they were the last of those bands. There was a lineage of bands like that had that stomp to them. And what has there been since? I mean, I guess you could make an argument for Ty Segall in some of his stuff.
But Ty Segall's nowhere near mainstream. OC's nowhere near mainstream. The only one you can say, Kurt Vile, nowhere mainstream.
Right.
However, the Black Keys, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, but the thing is, the Black Keys, I mean, they broke out with Rubber Factory, which is that's the same year as Elephant, isn't it?
No, Elephant is 03. Elephant is 03, Rubber Factory is 04.
Yeah, I remember that. I mean, they both came out when I was in Phoenix, so that's why I kind of make the association. But they were right around the same time. And that's when there was a movement. Remember, the Hives were 02, and you had some of that garage rock. And so the Keys kept it going. The Keys kind of break out in 04. At that point, the White Stripes were 4 years into their ride. By the time the Keys get to like 2009, 2010, they're making records with Danger Mouse and getting licensed up the wazoo, Gold on the Ceiling and stuff like that. And so, yeah, that might be the outer edge of it with the Black Keys. But basically, the Stripes are the last one to do it really, really, really well in a mainstream. They had the warm spotlights on them and they knocked it out of the park. And they were the last band to do that.
They were, yeah.
So, I said, take it.
Dan Auerbach may be the only person who'll have something to say about that. That's it. But that's it.
Yeah.
No one else.
And think about it, though. It's kind of like the logical last step of. We just did this this first Golden Age of Rock series.
Yeah.
And think about you jump the rocks. You go from the initial the Ike Turners to Chuck Berry. Jump on the next rock, Elvis. Jump on the next rock like Stones and Zeppelin.
And Beatles,
Yeah, Beatles. Jump on the next rock, Black Sabbath. Jump on the next rock, AC/DC, and keep going.
And then you get Punk, Pistols, Clash,
Yeah, and I'm just saying, so keep jumping on those. And the White Stripes is probably the last of those rocks.
Yeah.
And so you can say that. So they're the end of the line. And they did it as well, if not better, than most of those bands. I think that Jack White is just as much of a talent. He's one of the brightest guys, I think, in the history of rock and roll. One of the most inventive. Again, De Steel is not their best record, but it's their greatest accomplishment, and I adore that record. One of the things about preparing for this album, or for this episode, was learning to fall in love with that record again. And not only that, but I guess a legacy of them too is the fact that people could stumble into a club, and that may be their biggest legacy. Is there may be like the last great word of mouth success. Yeah.
I mean, because like the word of mouth, has not pushed Ty Segall into like, it hasn't pushed OCs either.
You don't. Well, I mean, sort of. I mean, remember they played Red Rocks, but it doesn't get much bigger than that. The only other band, and they were more or less contemporary, is like MMJ, My Morning Jacket, kind of has word of mouth. Yeah. But okay, so we keep talking about the Black Keys and My Morning Jacket. Jump ahead 10 years. What Vampire Weekend?
Right.
But even then, they're kind of like it. It's a rich.
They're not even. I don't call them a rock band. They're a pop band. They're an indie pop band.
It's a well-off, educated, Ivy League educated Jewish kid from New York doing Paul Simon.
Yeah.
That's not exactly like traditional sort of in the club, scuzzy word of mouth.
Right.
So that's it. Just ends once you get past that era. The word of mouth breakout success becomes a thing of the past. At least in rock, it still happens in hip hop. It still happens. You get your TikTok accidents like Lil Nas X, but with rock, no, it just doesn't happen anymore, and probably never will. So too bad. All I could tell you, folks, is that both of us have what we think are good tastes. And I guess that's how we'll end this episode. If you think we have bad taste or good taste, or it tastes like shit, let us know. curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. I mentioned our Facebook Curmudgeonly community, which has been pretty active this week. There's been some fun stuff going on up there. Facebook.com/curmudgeonly. It's invite only, but unless you're like a pedophile that can't be within 500 feet of a school, we'll probably let you in. And then, Twitter, which is still around, even though Elon Musk is kind of turning it into a cesspool.
We're on there. We're active. We troll bands that we don't like or we think are nuts, but we also extol the virtues of bands and writers, especially writers that we do like. And then our handle there is @CurmudgeonPod. And so that's the places where you can find us. Also listen to us and subscribe to us at any of the platforms where you listen to all of the other podcasts. So maybe we won't be ahead of 60 songs that define the 90s, and we may not be ahead of anything that Tyler May and Co is doing, but we belong on the same fucking list, damn it. Put us number 3 in that queue, because we're just as sharp and we're just as weird as they are.